My son evicted me and gave my apartment to his wife's brother. That Saturday, they threw a birthday party, but I walked through the door with someone they never foresaw. Their faces turned red. The eviction notice shook in my weathered hands as I stood in the hallway of the apartment building I had owned for 30 years, watching my only son, Marcus, change the locks on what used to be my front door. The morning sun streaming through the hallway windows seemed to mock the darkness spreading through my chest as Marcus worked with efficient, practiced movements, never once meeting my eyes while his wife Angela stood behind him with a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. "Dad, it's time you downsized," Marcus said, his voice carrying that professional detachment he must have learned in law school, the same law school I had paid for by selling my vintage car collection and working double shifts at the factory despite my deteriorating back. "This apartment is too big for you anyway, and Tony needs a place to stay while he gets back on his feet," he continued, referring to Angela's brother who, at 35, had never held a job for more than 3 months and whose idea of getting back on his feet usually involved sleeping until noon and playing video games until dawn. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that my son was evicting me from my own home to give it to someone who had contributed nothing to its purchase, maintenance, or the memories that lived within its walls. I remember the day we moved into this apartment like it was yesterday, though it was actually 32 years ago when Marcus was just 4 years old, and his mother Elena was still alive, still healthy, still believing that the family we were building would last forever. Elena had gasped when she first saw the view from the living room windows, the city skyline stretching out before us like a promise of all the good things to come, and little Marcus had run through the empty rooms, his laughter echoing off the walls as he claimed the biggest bedroom for himself, not knowing that I had already planned it to be his. We had saved for years to afford the down payment, Elena working nights at the hospital while I pulled overtime at the factory, both of us sacrificing so that our son could grow up in a good neighborhood with good schools and opportunities we never had. The apartment had been our American dream made tangible. 4 walls and a roof that meant security, stability, and most importantly, a legacy to leave our son. Now that same son stood before me, handing keys to Angela's worthless brother while treating me like an unwanted tenant whose lease had expired. "I've already had your things packed," Angela announced with that fake sweetness she had perfected over the years, the same tone she used when she would tell Elena during her chemotherapy that she was looking so much better, even as my wife wasted away before our eyes. "The moving truck will be here in an hour to take your belongings to the senior living facility we've found for you. It's very nice, Dad, really. They have activities and medical staff on site." She said, "Dad," like the word tasted sour in her mouth, and I noticed she couldn't quite hide the gleam of victory in her eyes as she watched me process what was happening. The senior living facility she mentioned was across town, a converted motel that now housed elderly people whose families couldn't or wouldn't care for them, where the walls were thin enough to hear every cough and cry in the night, where the smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of despair and abandonment. I had visited a friend there once, and I had left promising myself that I would never end up in such a place, that I had worked too hard and saved too carefully to spend my final years in what amounted to a waiting room for death. The power of attorney document I had signed during my recent heart surgery felt like a noose around my neck, as Marcus explained, in his lawyer voice, how everything was legal and above board, how he was acting in my best interests, how this was really for my own good. "You gave me the authority to make these decisions, Dad," he said, finally looking at me but with eyes that belonged to a stranger, not the boy I had taught to ride a bike, who I had stayed up with during his nightmares, who I had held when he cried after Elena's funeral. "The doctors say you shouldn't be living alone anyway, not after the surgery, and this way the apartment stays in the family." By family, he meant Angela's family, because Tony was already measuring the windows for new curtains, already talking about which wall he would mount his television on, already acting like he owned the place while I stood there like a ghost in my own home. The cruelest part was that Marcus was using my health scare against me, weaponizing the vulnerability I had shown by trusting him with power of attorney, turning my moment of weakness into his opportunity to steal what I had spent a lifetime building. That first night in the motel room they had booked for me temporarily, while my space at the senior facility was being prepared, I sat on the edge of a bed that creaked with every movement, surrounded by hastily packed boxes that contained the remnants of my life. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke despite being supposedly non-smoking, and the walls were so thin I could hear the couple next door arguing about money, their voices a constant reminder of how far I had fallen in just one day. Among the boxes, I found our family photo album, the one Elena had meticulously maintained throughout our marriage, filling it with pictures of birthdays, graduations, vacations, and ordinary moments that had seemed so unremarkable at the time but now felt like treasures from a lost civilization. There was Marcus on his first day of kindergarten, his backpack almost as big as he was, grinning with excitement and missing his 2 front teeth. There was Elena teaching him to cook her mother's pasta sauce recipe, both of them covered in flour and laughing at some joke I couldn't remember. There was the 3 of us at his high school graduation, Marcus in the middle with his arms around both of us, his face bright with possibility and promise. Looking at these photos, I couldn't reconcile the loving son in these images with the cold stranger who had changed my locks and exiled me from my own life. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture, a slow descent into invisibility that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Marcus blocked my phone calls after I tried to reason with him, sending me straight to voicemail, where I would leave increasingly desperate messages that I knew he would delete without listening to. When I went to the apartment building to retrieve more of my belongings, things that Angela's moving crew had forgotten to pack, the doorman Carlos, whom I had hired 20 years ago and always treated like family, looked at me with pain in his eyes as he explained that Mr. Marcus had left strict instructions that I wasn't to be admitted to the building under any circumstances. "I'm sorry, Mr. Robert," Carlos whispered, glancing around nervously as if Marcus might materialize from thin air. "I need this job. My kids, you understand." I understood all too well. Marcus had everyone under his thumb now, wielding the power I had built over decades with the casual cruelty of someone who had never earned it himself. The chance encounters with my former neighbors were perhaps the worst part of those early weeks, running into people at the grocery store or the park who would look at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, unsure of what to say to someone whose own son had thrown him out like yesterday's garbage. Mrs. Patterson from 4B, who had babysat Marcus countless times when he was young, couldn't meet my eyes as she told me about the loud parties Tony was already throwing, how the music went until 3 in the morning and the hallways reeked of marijuana. "It's not the same without you, Robert," she said quietly, patting my arm with her arthritic hand. "That boy of yours, Elena would be so disappointed." The mention of Elena's name was like a knife between my ribs, because I knew she was right. Elena had loved Marcus fiercely, but she had also seen his flaws, his tendency toward selfishness, his attraction to material things over meaningful relationships. On her deathbed, she had made me promise to guide him, to keep him grounded, to make sure he remembered where he came from and what really mattered in life. I had failed in that promise, and the evidence of my failure was living in my apartment while I slept in a motel that rented rooms by the hour. But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Robert Chen wasn't some helpless old man who would simply fade away into obscurity. I had spent 45 years in construction and real estate, building not just buildings but relationships, networks, and most importantly, contingency plans. Every morning in that dingy motel room, I made phone calls to old contacts, people who remembered when a handshake meant something, and loyalty wasn't just a word in a mission statement. I called James Morrison, my army buddy from Vietnam who had become one of the city's most successful attorneys. Not the kind who advertised on bus benches, but the kind who had judges on speed dial and could make legal problems disappear with a single phone call. "Bobby," he said when he heard my voice, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, "I heard about what that boy of yours did. When do we strike back?" That was James, straight to the point, ready for battle even after all these years. The safety deposit box at First National Bank contained documents that Marcus had never seen, would never have thought to look for because he had always assumed he knew everything about my finances, my properties, my life. But children never really know their parents, not fully. Not the people they were before they became mom and dad. In that box were the original deeds, the trust documents, the real will that Elena and I had drawn up together, not the simplified version Marcus had seen. There were also photographs from my younger days, pictures of me with Thomas, my older brother who had become a millionaire in international finance, who Marcus barely knew existed because of a falling out we'd had when Marcus was just a baby. The fight had been about money, of course, about a loan I'd given Thomas to start his business that he'd tried to pay back with interest, and I'd refused, insisting that family didn't charge family interest. The argument had escalated. Words were said that couldn't be taken back, and we hadn't spoken in 15 years. But blood is blood, and I knew that if I called Thomas, if I told him what his nephew had done, he would come. The phone call to Thomas was one of the hardest I'd ever made, my pride fighting against my need with every digit I dialed. His voice, when he answered, sounded exactly the same as it had 15 years ago, maybe a little rougher around the edges, but still carrying that authority that had made him so successful in business. "Robert?" he said, and I could hear the surprise, the confusion, and underneath it all the hope. "Is that really you?" I told him everything, laying out the whole sordid story without trying to sugarcoat Marcus's behavior or make excuses for my own failures as a father. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he might have hung up, but then I heard him take a deep breath. "That little shit," he said, and despite everything I almost laughed at his bluntness. "I'll be there tomorrow. And Robert? We're going to bury him, legally speaking, of course." The relief I felt at those words was like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders, because Thomas didn't make promises he couldn't keep. And when he said he would handle something, it got handled. Thomas arrived the next evening in a car that cost more than most people's houses, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the car, looking every inch the successful businessman he had become. But when he saw me, saw the motel I was staying in, saw how far his little brother had fallen, his face crumpled for just a moment before hardening into something that would have terrified me if it hadn't been on my side. We sat in that terrible motel room drinking whiskey from plastic cups, and he told me about his life, his success, his regrets about our lost years. "I should have been there," he said, staring at the stained carpet. "After Elena died, I should have swallowed my pride and been there. Maybe if Marcus had seen that he had family beyond just you, family with resources and connections, he wouldn't have thought he could get away with this." But I shook my head, knowing that Marcus's betrayal went deeper than opportunity. It was about character, or the lack thereof. The plan Thomas and James developed was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering and psychological warfare. First, James discovered that the power of attorney Marcus had used was technically invalid because it had been signed while I was under the influence of pre-surgery medication, a detail that Marcus in his arrogance had overlooked. Second, the eviction itself was fraudulent because Marcus didn't actually own the apartment. It was still held in a trust that Thomas had helped me set up decades ago, a trust that required multiple signatures for any changes, signatures that Marcus had forged. But the real coup de grace was the discovery that Marcus had been embezzling from my pension fund, small amounts over time that he probably thought I wouldn't notice, but that added up to grand larceny. "We could send him to prison," James said matter-of-factly, laying out the evidence like a poker player showing a royal flush. "But I have a feeling you want something more poetic than that." The invitation to Marcus's 36th birthday party arrived through my nephew, Thomas's son, who Marcus had inexplicably invited despite barely knowing him. The party was to be held in my apartment, a black tie affair to celebrate Marcus's success, his new promotion at the law firm, his beautiful life with his beautiful wife in his beautiful home. The invitation was embossed, expensive, the kind of thing Angela would have spent hours selecting to make sure it conveyed the right message about who they were, or who they wanted people to think they were. Reading it, seeing my address printed under Marcus's name as if he had any right to claim it, I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. This wasn't just about getting my apartment back anymore. This was about justice, about showing Marcus and everyone who enabled him that actions have consequences, that fathers aren't disposable, that what goes around comes around. Thomas and I spent the weeks leading up to the party gathering our ammunition, working with James to file the necessary legal documents, coordinating with the authorities who would need to be present. We discovered that Tony had outstanding warrants in 2 states for fraud and theft, information that Angela had apparently known but hidden. We found that Angela herself had been fired from her last 3 jobs for stealing, though she'd managed to keep it quiet through threats and payoffs. The deeper we dug, the more rot we found, and I began to understand that Marcus hadn't just betrayed me on his own. He had chosen a partner who brought out the worst in him, who encouraged his greed and validated his cruelty. The boy I had raised was still in there somewhere, buried under years of Angela's influence and his own weak character. But that didn't excuse what he had done. If anything, it made it worse because it meant he had chosen this path with full knowledge of what he was throwing away. The night before the party, I stood in Thomas's penthouse apartment, looking out at the city lights and thinking about Elena. What would she say if she could see me now, planning my revenge against our only child? Would she understand, or would she beg me to forgive him, to turn the other cheek, to be the bigger person? But then I remembered something she had said near the end, when the cancer had taken almost everything but her mind was still sharp. "Robert," she had whispered, her hand barely a skeleton wrapped in skin. "If Marcus ever loses his way, promise me you'll do whatever it takes to set him straight. Even if it hurts. Even if it means letting him fall. Sometimes that's the only way people learn." At the time, I had thought she was talking about small mistakes, young person troubles. I never imagined it would come to this. The day of the party arrived gray and overcast, as if the weather itself was setting the stage for what was to come. Thomas left for the apartment first, dressed in his finest suit, playing the role of the long-lost uncle excited to reconnect with his nephew. He would be my eyes inside, texting me updates about who was there, what was happening, when the perfect moment would be to make my entrance. I dressed carefully in the suit Thomas had bought me, Italian wool that felt like armor against my skin, looking at myself in the mirror and seeing not the broken old man Marcus had tried to make me, but the successful businessman I had once been, the fighter I still was. James met me in the lobby of Thomas's building, handing me a thick folder of documents, everything we would need to destroy Marcus's carefully constructed life. "You ready for this?" he asked, and I nodded, though ready seemed like too small a word for what I was feeling. The drive to my apartment building felt both endless and too quick, like time was playing tricks on me. Carlos was working the door, and his eyes widened when he saw me approaching, flanked by James and 3 police officers in plain clothes. I handed him an envelope, inside which was the deed to the building, the real deed showing that I owned not just my apartment but all 12 units, had always owned them, would always own them. "Mr. Robert," he breathed, tears forming in his eyes. I knew something wasn't right. I knew Mr. Marcus was lying. I patted his shoulder, feeling the tremor in his hands as he handed me his master key, the one that would open any door in the building regardless of what locks had been changed. "It's time to go home, Carlos," I said, and he nodded, pressing the elevator button with something that looked like pride. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending to a courtroom where I would be both prosecutor and judge. Thomas's texts had painted the picture clearly. 50 guests. All of Marcus and Angela's social climbing friends, his law firm partners, her family who had always looked down on me for being working class, and Tony, drunk already and loudly telling anyone who would listen about his plans to renovate his apartment. Marcus was holding court in the living room, telling stories about his success, his beautiful wife, his perfect life, carefully editing out any mention of the father he had discarded like an old appliance that had outlived its usefulness. The last text from Thomas was simple. "He's about to give his toast. Time to come home." I didn't knock on my own door. I inserted the key, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open just as Marcus raised his champagne glass, his voice carrying over the crowd with the practiced confidence of a lawyer used to performing. To family, to success, and to knowing when to make hard decisions. The words died in his throat as our eyes met across the room, his glass freezing midway to his lips, the champagne inside trembling like liquid gold catching the light. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. 50 faces turned toward me, some confused, some recognizing me from the neighborhood, and Angela, poor Angela, dropped her wine glass, the crystal shattering against the hardwood floor I had installed myself 20 years ago, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. "Please," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had waited long enough, planned carefully enough to know that this moment was mine. "Don't let me interrupt your toast about family, Marcus. I'm particularly interested in hearing about these hard decisions you mentioned. Was it hard to forge my signature on the eviction notice? Was it hard to change the locks while I stood in the hallway like a stranger? Or was the hardest part looking me in the eye while you did it, knowing that your mother would be spinning in her grave if she could see what you've become? I walked into the room, James and the officers behind me, and I could see Marcus's face cycling through emotions like a slot machine looking for the right combination. Shock, anger, fear, and finally, the desperate calculation of someone realizing they've been caught. "Dad," he started, his voice cracking like he was 16 again and I'd caught him sneaking back into the house after curfew. "This is all a misunderstanding. We can talk about this privately." But I raised my hand, the gesture stopping him more effectively than any words could have. "We're past private conversations, Marcus. You made this public when you threw me out publicly, when you told our neighbors I was senile, when you let Tony hear damage property that was never yours to give away." I pulled out the folder James had given me, thick with evidence, heavy with truth. "You see, everyone, Marcus has been operating under the assumption that he owned this apartment. He's been telling you all that he's successful, that he's made it, that this beautiful home is proof of his achievements. But like everything else about my son, it's a lie built on theft and betrayal." I moved through the room like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, handing out documents to specific people with calculated precision. To Marcus's law partners, I gave the forensic accounting reports showing his embezzlement from my pension fund, watching their faces pale as they realized the liability he represented to their firm. To Angela's parents, who had always acted superior to me, I provided the evidence of their daughter's employment history, her string of thefts, the warrants she had helped Tony evade. "You raised quite a pair," I told them, watching the mother's face crumble as she realized who her children really were. To Tony, still too drunk to fully understand what was happening, I handed his eviction notice, effective immediately, along with a notice that the police officers behind me were there to execute his outstanding warrants. "This is ridiculous," Angela shrieked, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking like cheap makeup under hot lights. "You can't prove anything. Marcus has power of attorney. This apartment is ours." But James stepped forward, his presence commanding attention in the way that only successful lawyers can manage. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, the power of attorney your husband used was obtained through fraud while Mr. Chen was under the influence of pre-surgical medication. Furthermore, the apartment was never transferred to Marcus's name. It remains in a trust that requires multiple signatures that were forged. Your husband is looking at fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and grand larceny. You're looking at conspiracy and accessory charges. And Tony here," he gestured to Angela's brother, who was finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation, "is looking at 5 to 10 years for his outstanding warrants alone." Thomas chose that moment to stand, drawing every eye in the room with the natural authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, his voice cutting through the growing murmur of shocked guests. "My brother Robert could have handled this quietly. He could have simply reclaimed his property through legal channels and left it at that. But Marcus, you had to humiliate him. You had to throw him out like trash, tell people he was senile, and then throw a party in his home while he slept in a motel that rents rooms by the hour." He pulled out his phone, connecting it to the smart TV that Marcus had installed, and suddenly the screen filled with security footage from the building's cameras. "This is from 3 weeks ago," Thomas narrated as everyone watched Angela and Tony throwing out boxes of Elena's belongings, laughing as they tossed photo albums into garbage bags, Tony pretending to dance with one of Elena's dresses before stuffing it into the trash. "This is who you're celebrating with tonight. This is who Marcus chose over his own father." The room erupted in chaos as guests began to realize the full scope of what they had witnessed. Marcus's law partners were already on their phones, no doubt calling emergency meetings to discuss damage control. Angela's parents were confronting their daughter, the father's voice rising as he demanded to know if it was true, if she had really done these things. Tony tried to run but was stopped by the officers, who cuffed him with practiced efficiency while reading him his rights. But in the center of it all, Marcus stood frozen, his face the color of old paper, his eyes locked on mine as if he was seeing me for the first time in years. "Dad," he whispered. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw my little boy again, scared and looking to his father to fix whatever had gone wrong. But that boy had made his choices, had chosen greed over family, had chosen Angela over me, had chosen to become someone Elena wouldn't recognize. The trust that owns this building, I announced, raising my voice to cut through the chaos,
All 12 units, not just this penthouse.
has been in my name since 1987. Thomas helped me set it up as a tax shelter, completely legal, completely binding. Marcus has never owned anything here. He's been living in my property, claiming my success as his own, building his reputation on a foundation of lies. I pulled out the final document, the one that would hurt the most. This is your mother's real will, Marcus. Not the simple one you saw, but the complete one, with all the codicils and conditions. She knew even then that you might lose your way. She wrote, and I quote, "If Marcus ever betrays the family values we've tried to instill, if he ever puts money or status above love and loyalty, then everything we've built should go to charity, to help families who understand what really matters." The party dissolved like sugar in rain, guests fleeing as if betrayal might be contagious, avoiding eye contact with Marcus and Angela as they headed for the door. Marcus's law partners informed him, in voices cold with professional distance, that he was suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Angela's parents left without saying goodbye to their daughter, the mother crying, the father's face set in lines of disgust and disappointment. Tony was taken away in handcuffs, his drunken protests echoing in the hallway until the elevator doors closed on them. Soon it was just the five of us. Marcus, Angela, Thomas, James, and me, standing in the apartment that had been the backdrop to so many family memories, now feeling like a crime scene where love had been murdered. "How could you do this to me?" Marcus asked, his voice broken, tears finally starting to fall. "I'm your son, your only son." The audacity of his question, the complete lack of self-awareness, almost took my breath away. "You were my son," I corrected him, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. "My son died the day you changed those locks. My son would never have thrown his father out of his home. My son would never have stolen from his mother's trust fund. My son would never have chosen his wife's worthless brother over the man who raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally even when he didn't deserve it." Angela tried to interject, but I silenced her with a look. "You," I told her, "are a parasite who attached yourself to my son and sucked out whatever goodness was left in him. But Marcus, you let her. You chose her. You chose this." Thomas handed Marcus a business card, his personal attorney's contact information. "You'll need this," he said simply. "The criminal charges will be filed Monday morning. I suggest you use the weekend to get your affairs in order." James added, "The eviction notice gives you 48 hours to vacate the premises. Any property left behind will be considered abandoned. And Marcus, I'd strongly suggest you don't try to practice law in this state again. Word travels fast in legal circles, and your name is about to become toxic." They left then, Marcus and Angela walking out of my apartment like ghosts of the people they had pretended to be, their footsteps echoing in the hallway that had once echoed with Marcus's childhood laughter. After they were gone, Thomas and I stood in the living room, looking out at the city lights that Elena had loved so much. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle we found in the cabinet, the good stuff that Marcus had probably been saving for a special occasion. "You did the right thing," Thomas said, but I wasn't so sure. I had won, certainly. I had gotten my home back, my dignity, my justice. But I had lost my son. Or maybe I had lost him long ago and was only now admitting it to myself. We drank in silence, 2 old men who had found their way back to each other through tragedy. And I thought about Elena, about what she would say if she could see us now. The next months were a whirlwind of legal procedures and life changes. Marcus was disbarred after the investigation revealed the full extent of his embezzlement. He and Angela divorced when she realized he could no longer provide the lifestyle she wanted. And she quickly attached herself to another lawyer, someone else she could drain dry. Tony went to prison, finally facing consequences for years of fraud and theft. Marcus's law firm settled out of court for the damage he had caused, and the settlement was enough to renovate the entire building. But I didn't keep it for myself. I converted all 12 units into affordable senior housing, creating a community for elderly people who had been displaced or abandoned by their families, people who understood what it meant to be thrown away by those you love most. Carlos became the building manager. His salary doubled and his family finally secure. He brought in his mother, who had been living in a substandard nursing home, and she became our unofficial social coordinator. organizing dinners and game nights and making sure no one spent too much time alone. Mrs. Patterson from 4B stayed on, now paying a fraction of her previous rent, and she started a knitting circle that met every Tuesday in what used to be my living room, now converted into a common area for all residents. The building that had once been a symbol of my success became something better, a refuge for people who had been deemed disposable by a society that values youth and wealth over wisdom and experience. I kept a small apartment on the second floor. Nothing fancy, just enough space for an old man and his memories. Elena's photos lined the walls, including pictures of Marcus as a child, the son I chose to remember rather than the stranger he had become. Thomas visited every week, and we rebuilt our relationship from the ground up. Two brothers who had learned that pride was a luxury neither of us could afford anymore. He brought his children and grandchildren, filling my life with the family I had thought I'd lost forever. They called me Uncle Robert and listened to my stories about the old days, about their grandmother Elena, who they'd never met but felt like they knew through my memories. One day, about 6 months after the party, I received a letter from Marcus. His handwriting was shaky, uncertain, like he'd written and rewritten it multiple times. He apologized. Not the calculated apology of a lawyer trying to minimize damages, but the raw, desperate apology of a son who had finally understood what he'd thrown away. He told me about his life now, living in a small apartment across town, working as a paralegal for a legal aid society, trying to rebuild his life and his character from scratch. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he wanted me to know that he thought about me every day, about the father he'd betrayed and the mother he'd dishonored. He ended the letter with a simple question: "Is there any chance, any at all, that someday you might forgive me?" I held that letter for a long time, sitting in my small apartment while the sounds of life echoed through the building. Laughter from the common room, music from Mrs. Garcia's apartment, the tap-tap-tap of Mr. Wilson's cane as he made his way to the elevator. This building was full of second chances, of people starting over, of families found rather than born. Could I give my own son the same grace I offered to strangers? I didn't know. Elena would probably want me to forgive him, but Elena had never stood in that hallway watching her son change the locks. She'd never been told she was too old, too useless, too much of a burden to deserve a home. She'd never watched her belongings get thrown in the trash while people laughed. I wrote back eventually a short note that said, neither yes nor no. I told him about the building, about what it had become, about the community we'd created for people his actions had taught me to value. I told him that forgiveness wasn't mine alone to give. He'd have to earn it from Elena's memory, from the community he'd disrupted, from the man he saw in the mirror every morning. I told him that if he wanted to visit, he could come to our Saturday communal dinners not as my son but as a volunteer, serving food to the residents, listening to their stories, understanding what he'd almost condemned me to become. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a chance, slim and conditional, but real. He came that first Saturday, standing at the door of the common room in clothes that were clean but worn, his face thin and marked by months of stress and regret. The residents looked at him with suspicion. They all knew the story by now, knew what he'd done to me. But they also knew about second chances, about redemption, about the long road back from mistakes that seemed unforgivable. He served food without complaint, cleared tables, washed dishes, and listened to Mr. Franklin tell the same story 3 times about his service in Korea. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, slowly becoming a fixture in the background of our communal meals, never pushing for more than I was willing to give, never assuming he had the right to my forgiveness. Angela showed up once, trying to cause a scene, demanding money she claimed Marcus owed her. But Mrs. Patterson and the knitting circle formed a human wall between her and the door, their knitting needles held like weapons, and Carlos escorted her out with a warning that the police were on speed dial. Tony wrote from prison asking for money, but that letter went straight into the trash where it belonged. These people who had once seemed so powerful, so important in Marcus's life that he'd chosen them over me, revealed themselves to be exactly what they'd always been: users, parasites, fair-weather friends who disappeared the moment the money and status dried up. A year passed, marked by the changing seasons visible from the windows Elena had loved, by the rhythm of communal dinners and game nights, by the slow healing that comes from being surrounded by people who understand loss and betrayal, and the choice to keep living anyway. Marcus continued to come every Saturday, gradually earning the grudging respect of some residents through his consistency and genuine remorse. He never asked for more than I offered, never pushed for a relationship I wasn't ready to give. He was learning, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that love isn't owed, it's earned, and that trust, once broken, might never fully heal. Thomas and I grew closer than we'd ever been as young men, the shared experience of almost losing each other making us value every moment we had left. He helped fund programs for the building, a visiting doctor service, a small library, a garden on the roof where residents could grow vegetables and flowers. The building became known in the community as a model for senior living, a place where dignity and independence were preserved, where being old didn't mean being forgotten. Social workers started referring clients to us, and we had a waiting list of people hoping to join our little community of discarded souls who'd found each other. The story of what happened at Marcus's birthday party became something of a legend in the neighborhood, told and retold with embellishments that made me sound more heroic than I felt. I was the father who'd fought back, who'd refused to go quietly into that good night, who'd shown that the elderly weren't powerless victims waiting to be exploited by ungrateful children. But I knew the truth was more complicated than that. I hadn't won so much as survived. And survival sometimes feels like a hollow victory when it comes at the cost of your only child. Yet when I looked around the common room on Saturday nights, seeing the faces of people who'd found family in each other, who'd discovered that blood isn't the only thing that makes you related, I knew that Elena would be proud of what her death and Marcus's betrayal had ultimately created. The building's transformation attracted media attention, and a local news station wanted to do a story about us. They interviewed several residents, capturing their stories of abandonment and renewal. But when they asked to interview me, I declined. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about the community, about showing that the elderly weren't just waiting to die but were living, laughing, loving, and supporting each other in ways their biological families had failed to do. The reporter pushed, wanting to know about Marcus, about the dramatic confrontation at the birthday party. But I simply said that was the past and we were focused on the future. Future. Marcus, who was there serving lunch that day, kept his head down and said nothing, understanding that his part in this story was as the villain, a role he'd earned and now had to live with. 3 years have passed since that night I walked through my own door uninvited and unwelcome, bringing with me the brother Marcus never knew he should fear, and the justice he never thought would come. The building thrives as a senior community, self-sufficient and proud, a testament to the idea that family is what you make it, not what you're born into. I'm 71 now, my health stable if not robust, my days filled with purpose if not always joy. The money from the settlement and the rent from the other units means no resident ever has to worry about being evicted, about choosing between medication and food, about being one illness away from homelessness. Marcus still comes every Saturday, though now he's allowed to stay for dinner, sitting at the far end of the table from me, part of the community but not part of my inner circle. We talk sometimes carefully about safe topics, the weather, the news, the residents' health. He tells me about his work at the Legal Aid Society, helping elderly people fight against predatory lending and elder abuse, using his legal knowledge to protect rather than exploit. It's a kind of penance, I suppose, and maybe someday it will be enough. Maybe someday I'll be able to look at him and see my son instead of the stranger who changed my locks. Maybe someday, but not today. Thomas asked me once if I regretted how things turned out, if I wished I'd handled it differently, perhaps more privately with less destruction. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I regret that it was necessary, I finally said. I regret that Marcus became someone who needed that kind of lesson. I regret that Elena isn't here to see what good came from something so painful. But I don't regret standing up for myself, for showing him and everyone else that fathers, that the elderly, that we aren't disposable. We're not just waiting to die. We're living, and we deserve to do so with dignity and respect. The sun sets now through those same windows Elena gasped at 32 years ago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that remind me of her favorite scarf, the one Angela threw in the trash. The building is quiet but not silent, filled with the comfortable sounds of people living their lives. Television from 3C, piano practice from 4A, laughter from the common room where the poker game is getting heated. This isn't the life I planned. isn't the retirement I imagined when Elena and I saved every penny for this place. But it's a good life. A meaningful life surrounded by people who understand that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Marcus sent another letter last week, longer than the others, filled with memories of his childhood, of moments he'd forgotten until losing me made him remember. He wrote about the day I taught him to ride a bike, running beside him for hours until he finally got it, how I'd cheered louder than anyone at his little games even though he spent most of the time on the bench, how I stayed up all night helping him with his science project even though I had to work the next day. He remembered Elena's funeral, how I held him while he cried, promising him we'd get through it together but we'd always have each other. I broke that promise, Dad, he wrote. I broke it in the worst possible way. But you kept yours. You got through it. You built something beautiful from my ugliness. And even if you never forgive me, I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I threw away. I see who you really are. And I'm proud to be your son, even if you're no longer proud to be my father. I keep that letter in the drawer with Elena's photos, not sure what to do with it. Not sure what it means for our future if we even have one. Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. And I'm still walking that path, some days moving forward, some days standing still. Some days taking a step back when the anger resurfaces. But I'm walking it surrounded by people who understand, who've taken their own journeys of loss and betrayal and somehow found a way to keep going. That's what we do here in this building that was once my dream home and is now something better. We keep going. We support each other. And we prove every day that being old doesn't mean being worthless, that being discarded doesn't mean being garbage, that being betrayed doesn't mean being broken beyond repair. Elena would be proud of what I've built from the ashes of our family. She'd probably be working the kitchen during our communal dinners, teaching the residents her mother's pasta sauce recipe, organizing birthday parties for everyone, because she never wanted anyone to feel forgotten on their special day. She'd probably even find a way to forgive Marcus completely, because that's who she was, someone who saw the best in people even when they showed her their worst. I'm not there yet, might never be there. But I carry her memory with me, let it guide me when I'm not sure what to do. Let it soften my heart when it wants to harden completely. The building is full now, all 12 units occupied by people who've become family to each other. We've had 3 weddings between residents who found love in their 70s and 80s. Proof that it's never too late to start over. We've also had 5 funerals, celebrating lives well lived and mourning the loss of people who'd become essential to our community. That's the reality of senior living. We're all on borrowed time, but we're spending it together, supporting each other through the good and the bad, the celebrations and the grief. We've created something special here, something that transcends the usual senior living facility model. We're not just neighbors. We're a family of choice, bound together by our shared experiences of betrayal and renewal. I think about Marcus every day, wonder what kind of man he's becoming in his forced humility, whether the lessons he's learning are taking root, or just being performed for an audience of one. He seems different, certainly, thinner, quieter, more thoughtful. But trust once shattered is like a broken mirror. You can glue the pieces back together, but the cracks always show and the reflection is never quite the same. Still, he keeps coming. Keeps serving, keeps trying, and maybe that's something. Maybe that's the beginning of something. Or maybe it's just the end taking its time to arrive. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've walked with me through the pain of betrayal and the slow journey toward something like healing, then you understand that life doesn't always give us the endings we want. Sometimes the best we can do is make something meaningful from the wreckage, build something new from the broken pieces of what we thought our lives would be. My name is Robert Chen. And I'm a 71-year-old man who was thrown out of his home by his only son, who fought back with the help of a brother I'd lost and friends I'd forgotten, who turned a building meant for one family into a home for dozens. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I have, and I'm living it with dignity, with purpose, and with the knowledge that sometimes the family you choose is the only family that matters. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to both the pain and the redemption, the loss and the unexpected gains. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, if you're dealing with your own family betrayals or struggles with aging parents or ungrateful children, know that you're not alone. There are communities like ours everywhere. People who understand that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, that age doesn't mean worthlessness, that starting over is possible at any age. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family relationships or the way we treat our elderly, then please share it with others who might need to hear it. Like this video if it touched your heart. Comment below with your own stories of family, betrayal and redemption. I read everyone, and they remind me that our experiences, while unique in their details, are universal in their emotions. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel where we share more stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, of families both broken and rebuilt, of the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of human relationships. Together, we're building a community of people who understand that life doesn't end when your children betray you, when your family abandons you, when the world tells you you're too old to matter. Together, we're proving that every ending is also a beginning. Every betrayal a chance to discover who really loves you. Every loss an opportunity to find something you didn't know you were looking for. Thank you for watching and listening my story.